In this video, I'm going to show you around a replica of a 100-year-old aircraft design, the Southern Cross, which was the first aircraft to ever fly across the Pacific Ocean from the United States to Australia in 1928. I'll point out the bits and pieces around the engines, I'll explain what this is, look at the cockpit, and then go on board a flight in this incredible piece of aviation history. I'm Paul Stewart and I make videos about planes and one car. This includes guided tours around interesting aircraft and museums and onboard flights around the world. And a huge thanks to the HARS Aviation Museum and Senior Project Engineer Jim Thurston for giving me access to this incredible piece of aviation history. The museum is just south of Sydney and has the last remaining airworthy Lockheed Super Constellation and a whole lot more. First, let's begin with some history. The Fokker F7, which is also known as the Trimotor, was actually designed with just a single engine in the nose and first flew on the 24th of November 1924. The following year, 2 additional engines were added under the wings and it was designated the F7A 3M, and I'll let you guess what the 3M part of the name stood for. The B model had a slightly enlarged wing area, the power was increased to 220 horsepower per engine, and that's the aircraft that went on to be called the Southern Cross, and the replica today is based on that. These Fokker aircraft dominated the North American airliner market in the 1920s, but interest dropped following a high-profile crash in 1931 where a famous football coach was killed. Government investigations discovered problems with the plywood laminate construction, resulting in stricter maintenance requirements and a temporary grounding of all flights. By this time, the similar and metal Ford Trimotor was increasing in popularity, and then the much more modern Boeing 247 and then the Douglas DC-2 appeared on the scene, and they were a whole new generation ahead, leading to the eventual phase out of this aircraft, with production stopping in 1932. This aircraft here is a replica of the 1926 Southern Cross, and this airworthy example first flew in 1987. It was grounded in 2002 following a crash landing and returned to the sky again in December 2023, and I was there filming that first flight in 20 years, as you can see here. Back on the ground, and let's begin the tour at the nose with the 3 Jacobs R755A2 300 horsepower engines. The originals were Wright J5As, but they were not readily available when the replica was being built. The first thing that stood out to me when I saw this was the size of the propellers. Surely a larger prop would move more air and generate more thrust. But you have to remember that the internal combustion engine design was still in its infancy, and they simply weren't powerful enough to spin a larger prop. The resistance in the air would have been too much, and the engines simply wouldn't have spun over. As I said before, the original came with just a single engine in the nose, but then 3 were fitted in total for the purposes of redundancy because the engines weren't especially reliable back then. And more power was also needed to allow it to carry more passengers and/or cargo. Let's zoom in on engine number 2 and I'll point out a few more things. It's interesting to see that the engine is fully exposed and there's no cowling around it, like you would see in the later DC-3. The thinking was that this would improve the cooling, having the air flowing directly over the engine components. It's a radial engine where the cylinders radiate out from a central crankcase, like spokes on a wheel, and this has the added benefit of the engine being much shorter. Every cylinder is also directly exposed to the incoming air, providing cooling as well. Contrast this with the Rolls-Royce Merlin V12, and that requires a much longer nose simply to fit the engine in. I'll explain some of these structures. In here are the cylinders, and inside these chrome-plated tubes are the push rods that run on the cam track within the grey nose case. These rods operate the valve rockers which open the cylinder intake and exhaust valves. A push rod opens the valves, and a spring in the valves then close them. These here are one of the 2 spark plugs per cylinder. Most aircraft engines have 2 primarily for redundancy, with each front and rear plugs being driven by totally independent electrical systems. There is also a benefit within the cylinder where the charge is ignited from both sides, causing better combustion and an increase in power output. The engine oil lubricates the top number 1 cylinder valve operating mechanism, then returns down each side to the 2 lower cylinders via these rocker box interconnecting drains, where it is drawn back into the engine by a dedicated scavenger pump. This has no oil pan, and the oil is returned to a 33-litre oil tank that is positioned behind the engine, ready to be shared with the engine components again as required. Let's mention this structure in front, and it's a piston for the variable prop. While it's currently in the coarse prop position, which means that there's a steeper blade angle, which does create more drag, but also moves more air per revolution, providing more thrust for high-speed cruise. During takeoff, if you need more thrust, oil is then pushed into that cylinder via this line here, changing to a fine pitch which produces more power at lower speed. These objects here are the counterweights to move it back towards coarse pitch once the pressure drops. Because the engine is off, oil pressure is non-existent, hence why it's currently sitting in the default coarse pitch position. This here is the air intake, a filter, and behind that is the carburetor. Here you can see where the clean fresh air is sent into the cylinders ready to join the explosion, and this around here is where the exhaust is removed. What's interesting is this shroud around the exhaust pipe, and that connects down to the carburetor, allowing the pilot to send hot air down there. That's important because the intake air can be very cold and wet, so it can actually ice up the carburetor when flying through rough and wet weather, which is not ideal. You might ask, well, why not just always have this hot air warming the carburetor all the time? But colder air is always going to improve the engine's power, so it's a compromise based upon atmospheric conditions, and the pilots have to keep a close eye on this. You want it cold enough to produce good power, but not too cold that it will freeze up. Moving back, and this strut here with no step written on it is of a special significance due to the incredible act of bravery by co-pilot P.G. Taylor back in 1935, 1,000 kilometres out of Sydney, halfway between Australia and New Zealand. I've got another video talking about that, so make sure you check that out after this one. Let's move around, and I'll mention this Venturi we have here. The instruments on the flight deck, such as the artificial horizon and directional gyrometer, are driven by vacuum pumps, and the pilot and co-pilots are independent of each other. The pilots are powered by the engine number 1 and 2, while only one engine is left for the co-pilot's instruments. So for the purposes of redundancy, this Venturi can also drive the co-pilot's instruments if the vacuum pump on engine number 3 did fail. Above that are the cables for the rudder and elevator, and duplicated on both sides for redundancy. The cables for the ailerons are within the fuselage, internal within the wing's leading edge, and then reappear just behind the pitot head, as you can see here. Now let's talk more about this wing, which if you look at it from the front, it does seem unnecessarily thick, and that leading edge would cause a lot of drag. I'm reminded of the B-36's incredibly thick wing, and they actually positioned the engines backwards because otherwise the props would be pushing air straight back into its own wing. The B-36 needed a thick wing because it had to carry a lot of fuel to fly directly from the United States to the USSR and back, but the reason was different in this Fokker Trimotor. Because it was made of wood instead of aluminium, to make it strong enough, they simply had to use more of it, so the whole wing is physically large. In the centre, they use ash hardwood as it's strong, but it's also too heavy for widespread use, so the rest of the structure is a lighter spruce and birch plywood from Finland. The wing is a single piece and 21 metres from tip to tip, and the wooden structure is covered with a polyester fabric to protect it from the elements. The large wing also provided a lot of lift at low speed, which was important when using relatively underpowered engines and rough airstrips. And it also allowed for a position up high to store the fuel where gravity could be then used to feed the engines. Walking in, and we see the main landing gear, and while the original aircraft would have had drum brakes, this is fitted with more modern discs at the front, and there's no brakes on the tail wheel. The layout was called a tail dragger, which was the norm of the era, and a benefit was that the highest part of the plane, which is the vertical fin, is going to be lower to the ground when they're moving slowly, which allows it to fit inside hangars. Remember that back then, buildings were really not anywhere near as tall as they are now. There's no direct steering control with the wheels, so turning the aircraft is done via differential braking of either of the main wheels. Once their speed was increased, such as during the takeoff roll, steering was controlled with the rudder. Moving back towards the tail and along the tubular steel fuselage, which was wrapped in fabric to reduce the weight. As they were not pressurized, the skin did not need to be especially strong and was only needed to protect the frame from the weather, so fabric was fine. A significant difference with the Ford Trimotor from the same era was that the Ford was an all-metal design, which Henry Ford himself argued was safer. Now a bit of a tangent here, but interesting nonetheless, the Ford used aluminium because it was light and corrugated it because that added strength. But it did increase drag. The design was similar to what Junkers were using in Europe. In fact, they sued Ford and won when Ford attempted to sell the Trimotor in Europe. Later on, Ford countersued them, hoping to take advantage of the anti-German sentiments between the wars, but lost again with a court finding that they did infringe on Junkers' patents. It had a flat-sided fuselage, which was the norm of the era, but it did result in much of the pressure being focused on the corners rather than being spread along the whole wall. It was actually the Douglas DC-3 which was the first mass-produced airliner with a circular fuselage, and that was one of many revolutionary design features that I talk about in my video looking at that. For comparison's sake, here's the DC-2, which otherwise looks very familiar, but it has flat sides, as you can see here on this example at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. Here's those flight control cables connecting physically with the cockpit's controls right along the side of the fuselage and back to the tail. I suppose that having them externally allowed for easier inspection. There was no boosting of the controls, so it was purely the pilot's muscles pulling the cables and moving the control surfaces in flight. At the tail, we'll look at the horizontal stabilizer. There were no trim tabs on the elevator, so instead the whole stabilizer could be trimmed via this here, which could raise or lower the leading edge, releasing the pilot from having to constantly pull back on the yoke. This cable here connects the elevator to the yoke, while this cable here connects from the rudder and directly to the rudder pedals you'll see inside the cockpit. This smaller cable down here can provide rudder trim and is attached to an electric motor in the tail, which would not have been on the original. Now it is all relative, although the rudder on this isn't especially large. In an instance of an engine failure resulting in asymmetric thrust, the pilot would need full rudder in the opposite direction. But because it's such a long fuselage, the rudder has a much greater authority than if it was a shorter fuselage. Engine number 1 and 3 are also close-ish to the center line thanks to the small props, so again, you'd have less dead weight further out from the sides during a failure. Maintaining the full rudder would have required a lot of strength though. In fact, in the DC-3, during an engine failure, you'd need a total of 180 pounds, which is around 80 kilograms of foot force stamping on the non-hydraulically boosted rudder pedal. The Boeing 707's engineers knew that the pilot would not be able to maintain full rudder, so in fact the rudder itself is actually the only hydraulically boosted flight control on the entire aircraft. So in the end, a larger tail causes more drag, so it's a compromise between maintaining adequate authority, but also the lowest amount of drag possible. This down here is just a strut to maintain the horizontal stabilizer's integrity. The single tail wheel is fully cast-steering, like a supermarket trolley, but it can be locked in a straight forward position by a pilot during takeoff or landing, as you can see here with this control in the cockpit. On the takeoff and landing roll, the plane can be steered by the rudder. Please support me as I make these videos by clicking on the thumbs up and making sure that you subscribe. It helps the channel grow and tells YouTube that you like these types of videos. Let's step inside the fuselage, and what surprised me was how high the roofline was. I didn't feel like I had to stoop as much as I expected. In the tail, there can be a toilet positioned here, and that reminds me of my guided tour around the Qantas Founders Museum in Longreach, where I talk about the evolution of in-flight toilets, which we take for granted now, but back in the day, you'd have to cross your legs until the pilot could land near a tree, do your business, and take off again. Spinning around forward, and there was the central aisle with rows of single seats with frankly a great view out of those big windows. Again, this was not pressurized, so the windows could really be as large as the designers wanted. Here's seat 1 Alpha on the left, and I'll be showing you more footage from this seat when I go on board a flight later in the video. Let's use this step here and move up into the cockpit, and I'll position myself in the captain's chair on the left. The fuselage walls themselves were very thin pieces of wood, which kept the wind out, but little else. In fact, it would have been very cold and very noisy in here, and I'll explain that later in the video once we go flying. There was none of the insulation you see on this A380's cabin wall I filmed in Toulouse a few years ago. Let's immediately turn around and talk about the fuel system, where the tanks were simply positioned up high so that they could use gravity to feed the engines. There's 4 319-litre tanks, although just 3 are represented on these sight glasses. Below is the fuel control panel, where you can cross-feed all of the engines from any of the tanks. Behind that is painted plywood, and that's actually the wing's front spar running the full length out to both wingtips. Moving back forwards, and you can see these cables here which go up to the wing and out to the ailerons. Both yokes move in unison, so when one moves, the other does as well, allowing both pilots to feel what's happening and potentially help each other out. Remember that there was no hydraulic boosting, so sometimes quite a lot of muscle might be needed to move the flight controls. Under here are the rudder pedals connecting directly to the cables running along the side of the fuselage, and also the brake pedals. In the centre are 3 lots of 3 levers, colour coordinated for different roles, but one for each engine. Blue is the pitch control, so if you push it well forward, that pushes oil into that cylinder I mentioned before, resulting in a fine pitch, while pulling it back results in a coarse pitch. In the centre is the throttle for the 3 engines, and in the red is the fuel mixture. This is important because as the aircraft climbs, the air becomes less dense, but the same amount of fuel would otherwise flow in, so you want to actually decrease the fuel flow at higher altitudes, otherwise the mixture would be too rich. Below that, this controls the carburetor heating, and that dial up there shows you the temperature, and you need to stay out of the yellow band because that's when the icing is predicted. Below here are the emergency fuel and oil shutoff controls. There were no fire suppression systems on the engines, so the plan will be to cut off the fuel and oil and then land as fast as possible, while there were fire extinguishers for fires within the fuselage. This wheel below the captain's right leg was to trim the horizontal stabilizer I mentioned earlier. Behind that was the control to lock the tail gear in the straightforward position for takeoff and landing. Moving up, and we have 3 dials displaying 3 different engine parameters for each engine. At the top is the engine oil temperature, the oil pressure, and the fuel pressure. Below that are the revs per minute for each engine, and then further down is the manifold pressure. These instruments here are obviously not shared with the original Southern Cross. On the left is the VHF communication radio, and that is duplicated on the other side. Under that is the transponder, updating other aircraft, airports, and the Flight Radar 24 app, the aircraft's location. On the right is the other radio and the audio selector panel. Let's discuss how the engines start. There's 2 large batteries that can be used, or a ground battery that can be attached, and then either of the 3 engines can be started first. Engines number 1 and 3 both have alternators for ongoing electrical generation in flight. Up here there are 2 switches to activate both batteries, and then moving into the center are the main ignition switches. This is the fuel boost pump, the fuel prime to pump raw fuel in, and then the starter switch. The original engines were developed prior to electric starter motors, and they used a starter unit with an inertial flywheel that was spun using hand cranks. Once that flywheel was spinning fast enough, the pilots engaged a clutch, connecting that to the crankshaft, and then spun the engine over. There's obviously a glass windscreen in front, but on the sides there was just this gap. The windscreen itself was designed to deflect much of the wind and rain away, but some would still have got in this space. These were actually emergency exits, and during the long flights, where auxiliary fuel tanks were inside the fuselage, these were where the pilot would enter and exit the cockpit. Stepping out and moving towards the back, and I'll show you the emergency exit in the case of a ditching or rolling over. Completely off topic, but I recall visiting the cockpit of a Lufthansa 747-8 after a flight into Tokyo, and the captain had a similar escape door open just above him, with the cigarette hanging out in one hand and a can of Coke in the other. Luckily for him, the refueling attachments are positioned elsewhere on a jumbo jet. And here is how they do refuel it, with crew having to climb up through that exit and then lift a hose up and then attach it in there. And speaking about fuel tanks, during the record-breaking flight across the Pacific Ocean, they installed a 1,000-gallon tank in the front of the cabin because that was closer to the centre of gravity, and they had to use a hand pump to move that fuel up into the wing-mounted tanks to then go down into the engines. The navigator and radio operator sat further back in the available space, and a smaller tank was added for the trans-Tasman flight between Australia and New Zealand. Now let's go for a flight in this incredible piece of aviation history. Now I have uploaded a separate video which includes just the in-flight footage and no talking, so if you want to see that, I'll link to that below. Let's start engine number 1. First up, and this bit isn't on camera, but someone will manually turn the blades to check if there's any hard spots which might indicate hydraulic lock. Then, using the starter motor, the engine is turned over to confirm that no oil is sitting in the bottom of the cylinders. That hydraulic lock could damage the aluminium connecting rod during the start. Following that, there's a 4-second fuel prime to start the radial engines. As I mentioned before, they can use the onboard battery or a ground power unit to start the first engine. In this case, they use the onboard batteries. Once going, the alternator starts charging the batteries, which can then be used to start the next engine. The captain throttled up all 3 engines, and the noise increased and we slowly started to lumber our way forward. During another conversation, he told me that he used to fly the Airbus A340-300s, and they were notoriously underpowered, until the larger engine 600 series arrived, and I wonder if this was kind of what it felt like flying one of those. The tail wheel is lifted off the ground at around 25 knots, and then the rotation happens at around 55 knots. As I said before, the large wing generated a lot of lift at low speed, so the actual liftoff happened fairly quickly and was very graceful. We gradually climbed at around 65 knots, and the VNE, which stands for the Never Exceed Speed, was 109 knots in this aircraft. By the way, it's always special taking off and seeing a Boeing 747-400 sitting there. That aircraft at the museum is the only remaining Qantas 747-400 series in the country, with a 747-200 retired up in Longreach in regional Queensland. What really stood out to me was how loud it was on board, and while that was to be expected, and we were given noise-cancelling headphones, when I took them off to move around the cabin to film, the noise really was quite painful. The vibration was also quite intense, especially when I sat in the seats that were further aft. It highlights how incredibly fortunate we are these days, where airliners are so quiet and comfortable. And speaking about feeling fortunate, how incredible does the lighthouse and blowhole look as we flew over the coastal town of Kiama, around 80 kilometres south of Sydney. I mentioned before the flight about installing auxiliary fuel tanks within the centre of the fuselage on the long flights. Because the noise was so loud, it was impossible for the pilots in the cockpit to talk with the navigator and radio operator in the tail, so they had to write messages on a piece of paper and use a stick to reach forward and back to each other. It was a slightly less sophisticated system than that used in the Convair B-58 Hustler, which used cables to send messages between the 3 crew if the radio system failed. And check out my video looking at that on my channel. As I said, there's more footage in my other video which I'll link to. Descending back down into Shellharbour Airport, and the captain told me that the target speed as we crossed the airport fence was around 65 knots, and touchdown just a few knots below that. The stall speed of the trimotor was around 44 knots, so we kept above that until we're on the ground. It was an incredible experience, and I feel very fortunate to have been allowed on board, and I hope you enjoyed the video. They're raising funds to purchase a new spare engine that will allow them to continue flying around Australia and possibly further, so I'll include details about the fundraising in the video description below. Please give the video a thumbs up and check out my channel for many more similar videos, and thanks for watching.